Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, our guests discuss the intersection of generative AI and critical thinking, posing the crucial question, does Gen AI help critical thinking or erode it? The general takeaway is a positive one, although there are many factors that must be established before we get to that point. And we not only examine AI's potential impact on critical thinking, but our guests apply their own critical thinking on how AI can be effectively frameworked, deployed, and used in higher education and scholarly publishing. And during this 4-part series, which is brought to you with support from SAGE, we'll supplement our theorizing with tactical ideas for ensuring critical thinking is preserved and enhanced during the use of Gen AI. Joining me are the author and tech philosopher Dr. Tom Chatfield, Dr. Leo Lowe, Dean and Professor of the College of University Libraries and Learning Services at the University of New Mexico, and Katie Metzler, Vice President of Books and Social Science Innovation at SAGE. In this third episode of our series, we discuss institutional policies that need or should be developed in the selection, use, and assessment of Gen AI, as well as the key ethical questions we're all wondering about. I'm wondering if any of you have any perspective on, institutional policy that needs to be developed in the selection, use, and assessment of generative AI in higher ed, and what that might look like. And Leo, why don't we kick this off with you first?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I'm leading or developing the AI Empowerment Initiative. The purpose of that is not at this point to develop institutional policy per se, but offering some guidance, which I'm seeing come more across the board, where there are some universities coming up with guidance and trainings rather than policies. Because I feel like we're not at that point, to be honest. Even nations and regions are trying to figure that out. I think that would impact a lot of the institutional usage or how they want to deploy AI in the educational setting. The UK, I believe, has come out with several. The Russell Group has their own guidance, which is one of the first ones out the gate. And in the US, Harvard have their own guidance, which are very useful, just helping people think about how to use AI and what are some of the things that they should be thinking about. At my own place, even within my own college, it's not institutional, but college-wise, we have experimented with ChatGPT. We pay for it, the premium version for our employee to think about how to incorporate that into their work. And one of the first things that people learned was that what can we upload to it without breaking any laws or breaking any kind of data privacy issues. So those are the things I think institutions need to think about, how to offer guidance to their employees and students.
Excellent, thank you. And Katie, I'll just jump over to you and wonder, like, your thoughts broadly, but also I guess. I mean, you mentioned that you're setting up guidelines for authors and that kind of thing. So how does that look? What does that look like from your perspective?
So at Sage, as I mentioned, we've actually just set up a generative AI steering group. And the goal of that group, which is made up from leaders across our business, so across technology, product, governance, productivity, and publishing teams, is really to help us all keep on top of the really rapidly changing environment and to make recommendations to the business about actions that we should take. So that includes steps that we need to take to protect our content and our authors' IP. And I think there's a lot more we could say about IP, intellectual property, copyright. And it's great to have Tom on this podcast, who I know is an expert in many of these things. But we also need to provide guidelines for our staff on the ethical use of AI. So as Leo mentioned, we get a lot of questions from our staff saying, they can see the potential productivity gains, but they want to be very careful that they're not breaking any data privacy or data protection rules. And of course, we want to be protecting our authors' IP. So we need some support. We need some infrastructure and support to help us do that, and that's the role of the generative AI steering group. But it's also there to help us think about opportunities for
Hmm.
innovation and potential
Right.
areas for investment, because as we said, we think there are lots of really exciting applications. So it's about managing risk and opportunity.
And then, Tom, over to you.
Yeah, so I think there's a hunger for guidelines on this, and at the moment there's often a
Right.
mismatch between what people are doing, and sort of how far the guidance goes, and trying to bridge that divide seems incredibly important. I think making people aware of risks is very significant, because a lot of people are just not very informed about the ways in which some foundation models have infringed a lot of copyright and intellectual property, and are very, very opaque and not trustworthy in ways that create a lot of risk that people may be unaware of. And similarly, uploading stuff to models, again, it can be very opaque what you can do and what you can do with it and so on. As Katie told the story earlier about some academics submitting hallucinated references to a parliamentary inquiry. And of course, part of the danger of that is that's been spotted, obviously, but how much stuff isn't being spotted, how much convincing but bogus kind of garbage data is out there in the world, polluting the inputs of further AIs and polluting the common pool of knowledge. So I think people really, really want to be educated about risks, but also I think they really, really want there to be kind of norms around opportunities that give them permission to experiment and share
Hmm.
and co-create guidance. I don't know nearly as much about this as Leo, who is working on this every day. But I feel when I go and talk to people about what they're doing with Gen AI and the excitement they have and the opportunities they have, I think there can be a real disappointment that the things they've done are not at all reflected in institutional thinking. And there's no perfect bridge between these things, but I would love it if there were sort of virtuous circles of learning between what's been practiced in classrooms, what institutions are trying and trialing and experimenting with, and the sort of fundamental principles, which seem to me often to come down to being very transparent about what exactly you're using and how you're using it for. I used this model on this day to do this thing, um, and then I did this afterwards, and just that being a baseline expectation. And then also the discussion of AI results and trying to have modes of assessment and
Hmm.
tuition and so on, where very broadly speaking, rather than it being a question you can pop into an AI and get an answer and then be scrutinized as if you're a potential villain for cheating, to sort of try and shift this towards, okay, as a first step for your assignment, go away and research this in AI. Come back, bring back the fruits of your research, and we'll discuss that. We'll iterate it. And I want to know, I want to see your prompts, and I want to see your follow up prompts, and I want to see what the discussion with you and the other people in your cohort, and I want to see how you found the AI was amazing and your reflections on what it didn't do, and so on and so on. But it's, my goodness, it's a tricky one because the risks are very real, and
Hmm.
to some degree, frankly, we just need the companies creating foundation models and others to step up on this. And there's a lot of global legal cases, a lot of requests around transparency and trust and so on. And I think users of all sorts need and deserve just far greater assurance ethically and pragmatically on those fronts. And I hope that in the coming months and years we'll start to get that.
Yeah. Leo, Katie, are you seeing some of what Tom said in practice and execution already, or?
Well, I can talk. Well, I just want to add on to something Tom talked about with institutional policy and people actually using it in real life,
Mhm.
and that's something we want to do, and we're planning on setting up many communities of practice, and they're hopefully with two-way communication, so that it's both you can inform both the administration and also the teaching and learning side of it, because one thing about we mentioned this so many times, it's changing so fast. There needs to be a constant dialogue. We cannot just set one policy and that's it. It's have to be revisited, revised all the time. So that's something I think will be beneficial to all the institutions to have that kind of setup, that there is a two-way communication.
Mm. Excellent. Great. So what are the key ethical questions then around using Gen AI in the classroom? And Leo, we'll start with you on that one.
Sure. I mean, we have mentioned many of those things already:
Mm,
fairness, bias, data privacy. But one thing I actually really care about, and we haven't talked about, is digital divide. In that, even with computers, internet, there's already a digital divide. If we add AI on top of that, you are just going to widen that gap. So we have to be super careful about how we want to introduce another new piece of technology into teaching and learning. Can all our students have access to it? What if somebody is able to pay for the premium version and have more kind of a more powerful tool at their disposal versus somebody who cannot? When a faculty at this point, because this is an early stage, if they want to embrace AI, fantastic. But what if somebody else, some students have access to it at a different level than others? How are they going to figure out how to assess that? So
mm,
that's something we need to really think about, is that how can we make sure it's equitable for all students and instructors? I know some universities have the resources to just pay for the enterprise version of, let's say, ChatGPT, and that everybody has access to it. But not every place can do that. For example, at University of New Mexico, some of our students live in very rural areas. How can we make sure that they can also take advantage of that? So
mm,
that's one part that I feel like we really need to pay attention to.
hmm And Tom, any thoughts?
I'm very glad that Leo mentioned the digital divide, because I think it's very easy to think mythically about new technologies and assume that they're all levelers and enablers, when in fact, unless you're very cognizant of people's different circumstances, they can be in effect assets that people who've already got more of various things can sweat to their advantage and can leverage their existing privileges. I think more generally, we've already seen with the challenges around remote learning and the kind of technologization of learning experiences, some potentially really dangerous framings that almost cast students as would-be cheats who are kind of in opposition to
Mm,
faculty and who thus need to be surveilled and monitored, and where distrust is kind of baked into the paradigm. It's a sort of war paradigm. Um, and there's all kinds of problems with sort of proctoring and surveillance systems, not least because, again, they can entrench existing inequalities and exclusions. They can effectively discriminate against people in less advantaged circumstances who are cohabiting with others who are carers, who have disabilities, who are, kind of not typical of the population that these algorithms were trained on. And all of this, if we're not cognizant of it, can potentially be amplified again by AI. If an institution purchases a mass series of licenses to an official AI, and then it surveils everything that its students do, and reports are compiled upon the basis of this, and potentially pseudo-scientific metrics of attentiveness and achievement and engagement are privileged, as we've seen in areas like predictive policing and emotional profiling and so on, which really have, I think, very little scientific merit, but look very factual or informative. And so there's a whole raft of dangerous assumptions lurking, ready to sort of be unleashed, unless you, from the beginning, really try and think of the students and educators as collaborators, as working together to better understand systems, unless you find ways to grant privacy and autonomy to students, and not to track stuff, to actively decide that there are certain traits and trends and measures that you are not going to use and quantify, because this can be a very dangerous thing to do. So all of that feels very significant to me, ethically speaking, and ultimately it's about what we expect from students and how we cast education and what we think their needs are. A last point here, I guess. People have, emotional needs as members of a student body. They have life needs. They have what you might call holistic needs. And just saying we've provided these amazing tools, and it's all there online for you now, and you can access this stuff, and you can skill yourself up, and you can learn these skills. It's very easy for technology to become part of a rhetoric of kind of cost cutting, the withdrawal of various kinds of care, the automation of various kinds of, provision that actually there's often a more intense need for. And so I think we saw during the pandemic, for example, an incredibly exceptional and disturbing and difficult set of circumstances, but also one in which, students were terribly, terribly isolated, terribly, terribly cut off. As a subset of the population, many students suffered even more than many others. And being kind of alone with technology was incredibly detrimental to mental health and exacerbated a lot of existing divisions. Obviously, the analogies aren't direct, but I think we have seen a very, very powerful natural experiment in kind of all remote facilitated digitized learning that very, very clearly really traumatized many people. And I wouldn't want to say there's a direct analogy, but I think the fundamental way we conceive of education and students and their relationship with faculty and assessment is challenged, and we absolutely can't afford to have a kind of oppositional mode between students and their institutions.
Right. Yes. Thank you. And Katie, anything you want to add to that?
Just to add that I really agree with all of the points raised by Tom and Leo. And I just add that as a social science publisher, we're very proud to publish a number of the academics who are really making us all aware of some of these important critiques of AI. And I just add a couple of additional ethical concerns around how the companies building the LLMs did so, by large-scale IP and copyright infringement, exploitative labor practices, and the climate impacts and related fears of, for example, water shortages driven by data centers. And I think educators can and should take the opportunity to talk about these ethical concerns as a way of helping students to think critically about the tools that they use, both generative AI tools and beyond. And there is thankfully such a rich body of social science research and evidence that educators can use when having these very important conversations with students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. I'm wondering, one of the flaws that we've mentioned with Gen AI is bias and discrimination that's in some ways inherent in sort of the data sets that it's based on. And so the question there then is it possible to strip that bias and discrimination out? And if not, how do we deal with that as we incorporate it into instruction? And Leo, once again, I'll just kind of start off with you.
So once again, we're talking about current technology.
Yes,
we can try
right.
to minimize it because of the training data is coming from really everywhere at this point. We don't really know, but it's coming from resources that have biases and discrimination within them. So there you go. But maybe at some point, AI can be trained to identify those and minimize them even more. However, having said that, having biases and discrimination in, information, it's just part of life. That's where critical thinking comes into play, where people can apply that and think about how to evaluate these and identify these so that they can make informed decisions. And that's what we're trying to teach students, right? And in the libraries, there are plenty of books with biases and discrimination, but that's how we want to, make sure that our students are able to see them, and then apply their critical thinking skills to utilize whatever information is there. So I see that as, yes, it's not ideal, but at the same time, it is a teaching and learning opportunity as well.
Mm-hmm. Tom?
I'll try and be brief this time, and I think we're all agreeing with each other, which I don't know if that makes for a good podcast or a less exciting podcast, but I'm doing a lot of nodding here. The idea of the unbiased data set is a mythical, mythological idea. It's not a thing. Data is made, not found. There is the less biased data set, and there are the biases we are more aware of. But unbiased data is an oxymoron as a phrase, because data captures part of the world rather than all of the world. So structurally speaking, it may be more or less representative, but it's never perfectly representative, because otherwise it is just the world. And so I just think that critical thinking is a really great fit for this discussion, just as Leo said, that we can absolutely try to make data less biased in certain ways. We can try to be more aware of its biases, and we can try to have some kind of iteration or governance, some kind of questioning, some kind of interrogation. But what we can't and shouldn't hope for is that there's this endpoint in which a data set has been stripped of its biases and is perfect. It's probably also worth mentioning noise at this point as a distinct phenomenon from bias. Bias, as we know, is when the data leans in a certain direction predictably, should we say. So when data has, for example, been gathered in cities or reflects urban life and thus misses out those who don't live in cities and doesn't reflect the way those people live. But noise is just variance that makes it kind of an imprecise measure of the truth, so to speak. So it might be the fact that when you ask people to guess about something or report on something, depending on the mood they're in and how much they've eaten, their self-reported scores are wavering all over the place, but not in a predictable direction. And one thing we can do much better than reducing bias is reduce noise in data sets, because noise is perfectly identifiable independently of our knowledge of bias. So we can do really great things in data sets by making them less noisy, by making decision-making processes less noisy. Saying, for example, well, given this particular set of data about X or Y, what does a particular interpretation of it look like? And algorithms can be much less noisy than people because they can be the same every time. So that sounds like a slightly technical point, but I think actually teaching people about both noise and bias and the differences between them can be another layer of kind of critical thinking about the ways in which algorithms are most and least useful. And essentially, they're really good at helping us, at supporting us to make less noisy decisions, and us being more predictable once we've decided on the principles we want to apply. But they're much less good at kind of vanishing bias. Instead, we need to be aware of bias and then bring our understanding of that to interrogate data sets and mitigate.
Excellent. And Katie?
I did just want to add something that I came across the other day, which I thought was really interesting, which was a press release announcing Latimer, which is a new startup, which is focusing on inclusivity within large language models. And so there are people actively working on this question. Is it possible to incorporate cultural and historical perspectives of Black and Brown communities into large language model training data and have a different and better, less biased outcome? Although I do agree that it will be very, very challenging and potentially impossible to see a future where that's completely eradicated. I also think it's always interesting in these conversations to think about what some of those examples look like. So I think when we talk about what does it mean for an LLM to include or incorporate bias data, and what does that look like on the output side, I thought there was an excellent article on a website called Rest of World, which talks about how AI reduces the world to stereotypes. And they analyzed 3,000 AI images produced by Midjourney to see how the Midjourney tool actually visualizes different countries and cultures. And what you can see is a very stereotypical output. So if you use the prompt, a Mexican man, you get a set of images which are very stereotypical, a man in a sombrero. If you ask if you ask Midjourney a set of other flaws, of other prompts, you will see the kind of stereotypical output that comes from those prompts. And so I think, there are risks around that for users who aren't applying critical thinking and may think that is a real representation of the world. And so I think it's always useful to tie this back to what do those examples look like.
Mm-hmm. You just heard from author and tech philosopher Dr. Tom Chatfield, Dr. Leo Lowe, Dean and Professor of the College of University Libraries and Learning Services at the University of New Mexico, and Katie Metzler, Vice President of Books and Social Science Innovation at Sage. This series is brought to you with support from Sage.
Join us next week when we examine some larger scale considerations, such as regional approaches to Gen AI governance around the globe, how scholarly publishers are operationalizing AI, and speculating a bit on what campus-wide policies might look like as Gen AI becomes even more commonplace.
As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.